The entire auction room went quiet the moment the old violin case was set on the table, not out of respect, out of pity. 3 of the most respected instrument restorers in the country had already examined it that morning, each one stepping back with the same slow headshake and the same carefully worded conclusion. Beyond saving, the damage from the house fire was too extensive. The spruce top had buckled and split. The varnish, a century-old amber finish that took generations to perfect, had blistered and darkened to something unrecognizable. The neck had warped. The tailpiece was ash. One of the assessors, a man who had restored instruments for the National Arts Center in Ottawa, quietly told the room that even attempting a repair would dishonor what the instrument once was. Standing at the edge of the crowd in a gray wool coat, her hands folded tightly in front of her, was Miriam Voss, 49 years old. CEO of one of the most prestigious classical music foundations in Canada. A woman who had spent 3 decades building institutions that protected musical heritage, funded museums and kept orchestras alive in cities where funding committees had long since lost faith. She had attended every major auction, every gala, every conservation summit that mattered. She was not a woman who showed emotion in professional settings, but this was not a professional matter. The violin in that case had belonged to her father, Heinrich Voss, who had brought it from Dresden in 1962 with almost nothing else. He played it in church basements and community halls across Nova Scotia while he learned English. He played it at her mother's bedside when her mother was dying. He played it at every one of Miriam's school recitals, standing in the back of the gymnasium, never wanting to draw attention, only wanting to be there. When Heinrich passed 2 years ago, the violin became the last physical thing that connected Miriam to the man who had given her everything. The fire at the storage facility had taken it in February. The insurance adjuster called it a total loss. The 3 assessors that morning agreed. And then, from the far end of the workbench, a man who had not been invited into that conversation looked up from a repair he was finishing on an unrelated instrument, and said, very quietly, that he thought there might still be something worth working with. Nobody in that room knew what was about to happen. Neither did he. Hugh Morrow was 43 years old. He had been a luthier, a maker and repairer of stringed instruments, for most of his adult life, working out of a small cluttered workshop on the 2nd floor of a converted building in Fredericton, New Brunswick. The sign out was hand-lettered and slightly crooked. The waiting list for his repairs was 8 months long, not because he advertised, but because musicians who had brought him broken things returned to their orchestras and their studios and quietly told other musicians where he had worked. He had not always worked in a place like that. In his early 30s, Hugh had been on a different path entirely. He had trained under a master luthier in Cremona, Italy, which is the city where Stradivarius built his instruments, and where the entire tradition of violin making still breathes as something close to sacred. Hugh had did something close to Canadian arts grant. He had come home with skills that almost nobody in the country possessed, and a set of ideas about acoustic design that his Sid's mentor said were genuinely original. He had begun building instruments from scratch, entering them in international competitions, talking to conservatories about partnerships. Then his wife Sylvie was diagnosed. It was a fast-moving illness, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Hugh spent those months beside her, in hospitals in Moncton and Halifax, and eventually at home, where they had moved their daughter Nadia's old bed into the living room so Sylvie could see the backyard while she slept. Nadia was 7. She spent a lot of those months sitting on the floor beside her mother's bed, drawing horses and reading picture books out loud. When Sylvie died, Hugh did not fall apart in a visible way. He kept working. He kept driving Nadia to school. He cooked dinner every night, and helped with homework, and showed up to every single parent-teacher interview. But the bigger ambitions, the original instruments, the competition submissions, the conversations, those quietly folded. There was no dramatic ending, there was just, slowly, less of it, until there was none of it. He took in repairs. He was exceptionally good at them. He paid the bills. He and Nadia developed a life that was small in its geography and very large in its specific rituals. Friday night pizza, Saturday morning skates at the arena 2 blocks away, Sunday afternoons where Nadia practiced her own violin while Hugh worked nearby, and neither of them felt the need to talk much. It was a good life. It was also a life lived slightly below what Hugh had once been capable of, and he knew it, and he had made a kind of peace with that knowledge that felt, on most days, like acceptance. On some days it felt like surrender. He had stopped being able to tell the difference. He was in Halifax that morning because a chamber ensemble had hired him to do a series of repairs on their collection before their spring season. He was not supposed to be involved in the assessment of the Voss violin. He had simply been in the same room. But he had seen the case, and he had looked at the instrument, and he had noticed something the three assessors had not lingered on. The back plate, the maple back that forms the structural spine of a violin and carries the resonance of the sound up through the body, was damaged, yes. But it was not destroyed. Beneath the scorching and the warping, the grain was still true. The joint that ran down the center of the back, which on older instruments can separate or crack beyond repair, was still holding. And the scroll, the carved spiral at the top of the neck that is both structural and almost impossible to replicate without losing something essential, was intact. To most people in that room, the instrument was a ruin. To Hugh Morrow, it was a ruin with a spine. Miriam looked at him for a long moment after he spoke. She had been told by three men with considerably more institutional credibility that the job could not be done. She was standing in a room full of people who were waiting for her to authorize the instrument's disposal so the auction of other items could proceed. She asked him two questions. How long would it take? And had he done anything like this before? He told her 6 months, maybe 8. And he told her about a fire-damaged cello he had restored in 2019 for a family in Prince Edward Island. Not the same instrument, not the same level of damage, but the same fundamental problem of rebuilding something that had lost its form while trying to preserve whatever truth remained underneath. She asked for that family's contact information. He gave it to her without hesitation. She called them from the hallway. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When she came back into the room, she told Hugh Morrow that she wanted him to try. The others in the room said nothing, but 2 of the 3 assessors exchanged a look that said everything. The violin arrived at Hugh's workshop in Fredericton on a Thursday afternoon in March, packed in a custom foam case that Miriam's foundation had arranged. Hugh set it on his workbench and did not touch it for 2 days. He just looked at it, the way he looked at every damaged instrument before beginning. Not to assess, he had already done that, but to understand. To find the line between what had been lost and what could still speak. Nadia came home from school that Friday and found her father sitting on his workbench stool, elbows on his knees, staring at the case. She set her backpack down. She looked at the violin. She said, "Is it really bad?" Hugh said it was the worst he had ever been asked to work on. She sat beside him on the second stool she had dragged over years ago, so she could sit with him while he worked. She looked at the violin for a while. Then she said, "But you're going to try." It was not really a question. He said yes. He started on Sunday. The first month was almost entirely deconstruction, careful, painstaking work, to separate what could be saved from what could not, to piece it so that it stopped contracting and could begin to be worked with. The maple back was treated with a humidity protocol that took 3 weeks before the warping began to ease. The spruce top was a different problem entirely. Large sections of it had to be replaced, which meant sourcing spruce of the right age and grain and density. Not from a supplier, because no supplier could match what a century-old instrument carried in its wood, but from another damaged instrument whose top had survived what its body had not. Hugh spent 2 weeks searching before he found one, through a contact in Quebec City who dealt in salvaged instrument parts. Miriam called every 3 weeks. Not to check on progress. She had said at the beginning that she trusted his timeline. But, Hugh came to understand, because she needed to be connected to the process. She asked questions that were not really about Luthery. She asked whether the original character of the instrument could survive such extensive intervention. She asked whether what he was rebuilding would still be, in any meaningful sense, the same violin. He told her, honestly, that he did not know. That restoration at this level was always partly an act of faith, that you tried to follow what the original maker had intended, the geometry, the graduation, the arching, as faithfully as the surviving material would allow, and that sometimes, when you got it right, the instrument played in a way that suggested memory. As if the wood still knew what it had once been. She was quiet for a moment after he said that. Then she said her father used to say something similar about music, that a piece of music didn't live on the page, it lived in what the player remembered of every time they had heard it before. Hugh didn't have an answer for that, he said it sounded right to him. After she hung up, he sat in the workshop, while Nadia practiced her scales in the next room, and thought about what Sylvie had said to him, near the end, about the instruments he had stopped building. She had not said it as a reproach. She had said it as an observation, quietly, on one of the evenings when she had enough energy to sit up and talk. She had said, "You stopped because of me, and I need you to know that I see that, and I need you to start again." He had not started again, he was aware, sitting in his workshop in April with the Voss violin in pieces around him, that this was the closest he had come. Summer arrived without announcement, the way maritime summers do, suddenly warm after a long and grudging spring. Nadia finished grade 7 and began spending her mornings at a violin day camp at the university while Hugh worked. He made real progress in June. The top replacement sections were fitted and joined, the graduations refined by hand until they matched the surviving portions as closely as he could achieve. The internal structure, the bass bar, the blocks, the linings, was rebuilt from maple and spruce he had been aging in his storage room for a decade, pieces he had been saving without knowing for what. There were setbacks. In late June, a crack developed in the repaired area of the back plate, a stress fracture, invisible until it announced itself. Hugh spent 4 days repairing it, and a week worrying about whether there were others he had not found. There were not, but the worry cost him 2 weeks of momentum. He did not call Miriam to tell her. He did not see the point in transferring that anxiety. He simply fixed it and kept going. In July he began the varnish. This is the part of violin restoration that most people don't think about, because a violin's sound is not only in its wood and geometry, it is also in its varnish, in the chemistry and depth of the finish that covers the wood and affects how the fibers vibrate. The original varnish on the Voss violin was gone. There was no replicating it exactly. What Hugh could do was research. He found references to the Dresden workshop tradition, from which Heinrich Voss's instrument likely came. A regional style that had its own particular oil resin formulation, reddish amber, applied in very thin layers over many weeks. He spent 3 weeks mixing and testing, before he found something he believed was close. He applied it in 14 layers over 6 weeks, letting each one cure before adding the next, working in the early mornings when the workshop temperature was most stable. By late September, the instrument was nearly complete. Hugh spent the final 3 weeks on the setup, fitting the bridge, cutting the nut, adjusting the sound post inside the body. All the small calibrations that determine how a violin speaks before it is ever played. On a Wednesday evening in early October, he rosined a bow and played the first notes on the restored violin. Nadia had positioned herself in the doorway of the workshop, without him noticing, still in her school uniform, her own violin case on the floor beside her feet. She stood very still. The sound that came out of the instrument was not perfect. It would need playing in, weeks or months of regular use before the wood fully re-engaged with vibration and found its voice. But it was not tentative either. It was warm. It was full in the lower register in a way that spoke to the quality of that maple back that had survived the fire. And there was something in its character, hard to name, easier to feel, that suggested the instrument had not forgotten itself entirely. Nadia, who did not often comment on her father's work because she understood it was something she was still learning to understand, said, "Dad, that sounds like it remembers." Hugh set the bow down. He said, "I think it does." The unveilings was held at the Glenn Gould studio in Toronto on a Saturday in November, which Miriam's foundation had reserved for what was described in the program as a private restoration ceremony. It was not entirely private. There were journalists, there were instrument makers and conservators, and people from the classical music world who had heard the rumors about what had been attempted in Fredericton. There were also several people who had been involved in the original assessment in Halifax, who attended, as far as Hugh could tell, with mixed feelings about what they were about to see. Miriam stood at the front of the room and spoke briefly about her father. She did not speak for long. She said that Heinrich Voss had believed, his entire life, that things made with care did not fully disappear, that they carried something forward even when they were broken. She said she had spent 2 years believing the violin was gone, and that she had been wrong, and that she was grateful in a way she did not have adequate words for. Then the case was opened. The room did not erupt. It went still, the way rooms go still when something exceeds what people were prepared for. The journalists leaned forward, the conservators moved closer. One of the assessors from Halifax, the one who had been most definitive about the impossibility of restoration, stood for a long moment with his arms at his sides and said nothing at all. A violinist from the Toronto Symphony, who had agreed to perform the first notes on the restored instrument, lifted it from the case and placed it under her chin. The piece she played was a short Bach partita that Heinrich Voss had reportedly played at his church in Halifax every Christmas Eve for 30 years. By the third bar, 2 people in the front row were crying. Hugh stood near the back of the room, beside Nadia, who had come with him and was wearing the dress she normally saved for school concerts. He watched Miriam's face while the music played. He saw the exact moment when whatever she had been holding for 2 years shifted, not released, that was too simple a word for it. Shifted, made room. After the music stopped, after the applause, after the journalists had their photographs, and the conservators had their questions, and the room had begun to breathe normally. Again, Miriam walked to the back of the room and stood in front of Hugh. And Nadia. She thanked Hugh with a formality that he could tell was the only way she knew how to hold herself together in public. Then she looked at Nadia and asked whether she was a violin player too. Nadia said she was. Grade 8 conservatory, working on a Telemann concerto. Miriam nodded slowly. Then she said something that Hugh was not expecting. She said that her foundation funded a residency program for young string players between 15 and 19, in partnership with 3 music conservatories across Canada. She said the program had existed for 11 years and had launched the careers of 26 musicians, who were now playing professionally, and she said she would like, if Nadia was interested, and her father was agreeable, for the foundation to begin tracking Nadia's development for consideration when she was eligible. Nadia looked at her father. Hugh looked at Nadia. He thought about Sylvie, about what she had said near the end, about starting again, about how he had understood that to mean his own work, his own instruments. He understood now, standing in the Glenn Gould studio with a violin playing Bach in the background and his daughter's face turned toward him, that he had been thinking too small. Starting again did not only mean him, he told Miriam yes. Then Miriam turned back to Hugh, and her formality loosened slightly, and she said that she had also been in conversation with the Foundation's board about establishing a restoration fellowship, a funded position, with a proper workshop and research support, attached to a partner conservatory. The kind of work that would be documented and taught. The kind of work that would make what Hugh had done in Fredericton, something that could be passed on rather than simply witnessed. She said she could not imagine asking anyone else to lead it. Hugh was not a man who showed emotion easily. The years after Sylvie had taught him a kind of controlled stillness that he had come to mistake, sometimes, for strength. But standing there, in that room, with the last note of the Bach still hanging somewhere in the air, he felt something give way in his chest that he recognized from long ago. From Cremona, from the years before grief rewrote him. That feeling of a door that had been sealed quietly admitting that it was not in fact locked. He said yes to that too. Later that evening, on the drive back to the hotel, Nadia fell asleep in the passenger seat with her cheek against the window, and the city lights sliding slowly past her face. Hugh drove through downtown Toronto in the particular quiet of a November night, when the streets are damp, and the buildings hold the light in a way they don't in summer. He thought about the violin, about the 14 layers of varnish, and the replaced sections of spruce, and the crack in the back plate that nobody but him knew about. He thought about the way the instrument had sounded in the studio, not perfect, but present. Not fully healed, but remembering. He thought about what Miriam had said at the lectern, about things made with care not fully disappearing. He thought she was right, though he would have said it differently. He would have said that broken things, when someone takes the time to understand what they were, before they broke, have a way of becoming more honest than they were, when they were whole. More themselves, somehow, for having been taken apart. He didn't know how to say that in a room full of journalists. He wasn't sure it could be said out loud at all, But he knew it was true the way he knew when a repaired instrument was ready. Not through measurement alone, but through something quieter. Something that lived below the surface of knowing. He drove north through the city, and Nadia slept. And somewhere in a case in the back seat, the violin rode in silence, carrying everything it had survived.